started again. So, thank you. And the chairman of the commission, Joshua Uppel, has joined us, so we're very glad he's here. He does have a 2 o'clock commitment, so when he sneaks out at that time, don't be surprised. It's not about the presentation. So we'll dive back in. We're going to talk about the policy implications, and as before, please feel free to ask questions or make comments throughout the presentation.
Hello, everybody, again. First, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the chairman here. Thank you all for coming and staying for the second part. So, first part, we talked about technology, and now we want to introduce the new policies and what implications will those policies have here in Colorado specifically, and in the Western Interconnect. My name again is Raphael Carvalho.
And I'm Carvalho.
All right, so let's start. Today we're going to be talking about, again, just brief review on why frequency response is important, the current state of regulation for frequency response. We also introduce NERC, the reliability coordinator, and then we'll talk about proposed frequency regulations and implications in Colorado, and also considering the Western Interconnect. We also talk about the Colorado wind energy capabilities and generators. And if we have time, we go over potential markets for frequency response. So again, why is this important? Frequency response is critical for reliability of the system. And generation and load must match, as I've presented to you guys on the last presentation. And when they don't, frequency will oscillate. And that frequency oscillation is critical because all the components of the grid are designed to operate as close as to 60 hertz, which is the desired frequency of the grid. But then how do we keep this frequency from oscillating outside a reasonable band from 60 hertz? Then the question is, who provides the services? Generators have to do that because we can't control load generally, and so they have to provide the services. And if we go so far in the imbalances between generation and load, then we might have large frequency fluctuations, which might lead to the activation of control systems in the grid, which will basically shed part of the load, and so they can keep that imbalance. They can correct that imbalance, and if that's not enough, then that can keep building up, and that can lead to blackouts. But in terms of policy, NERC has recently proposed new requirements for frequency response because that's so vital for the system. I'll talk about NERC in a second. Next slide. Also, there's a nationwide decline in frequency response reserves, particularly in the Eastern Interconnect, because they're just disabling their frequency response capability, and that can have potential reliability issues. So procuring frequency response is really vital for the grid reliability again. And once we have more penetration of renewable energy, we don't inherently provide the service. It raises the question if the grid will keep being reliable or not. So frequency response is basically an automatic response of generators to stabilize the grid frequency when you have an event. An event would be part of the load or generation getting out of the line. And it's provided by generators, as I explained earlier. Basically, what they do is, if we want to be operating at 60 hertz, if we have any fluctuations in frequency, so let's say we have a decline in frequency, we're going to increase our power output to stabilize that frequency, and if we have an increase in grid frequency, then we just derate our power output, so then we can again stabilize the frequency at the desired 60 hertz. The current state for frequency response requirements is there are no requirement so far, just because that's inherent from conventional generators, and they expect them to perform the service. But they can actually disable this performing the service, and because there are no incentives to enable frequency response capability, then why would they do that? Actually, they could even be penalized for providing the services because they are required to follow a schedule of generation, and every time they respond to a frequency event, they're basically changing the generation output, and they can be penalized for that. Well, although that's possible, it's very unlikely because the frequency to make a difference on the scheduled energy generation, frequency events would have to be really, really huge, and even if there were, that's the response takes place in few minutes, and the penalties are based on hourly averages of energy output. So it can be a problem, but not necessarily. So I just wanted to introduce NERC because, well, the question after all I've talked so far would be who would make sure that the grid is reliable? Who would make sure that we have enough frequency response capabilities? That's like keeping the grid reliable was a question reason in 1965 when they have the largest blackout in the history of this country. 30 million people lost power, and so in response to that, the DOE, the Department of Energy, through FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, gave power to this recently created corporation called North American Electric Reliability Corporation to make sure that the grid is reliable and set standards for that. Well, I showed this slide in the previous presentation, but basically here I show the NERC takes care of the whole North America interconnect, but it's divided in sub-regions. We'll be focusing today on the WEC because Colorado is there. WEC is Western Electricity Coordinating Council. And Jake will talk about balancing authorities.
So within the WEC, there are a large number of balancing authorities, and so each of these balancing authorities is what I'm going to be referring to, and they are the ones that are responsible for procuring frequency control services, and particularly to this presentation, frequency response capability. And so you can see here in Colorado, Colorado is comprised of two different balancing authorities, PSCO and Wacom. And you can see that there's a lot of smaller balancing authorities up in the Northwest. So NERC Current, so resource and demand balancing requirements standards have been put out by NERC. They have been in place for quite a while. So these requirements make sure that from the technology presentation that we have sufficient capacity in order to respond to regulate the grid frequency back up to 60 hertz in case of an event and during day-to-day operations. But there has never been a requirement for frequency response, which is responding automatically to a change in grid frequency. So through all of these BAL standards from NERC, they put responsibility on the balancing authorities and not the individual generators to procure these resources. And so what this means is that we may, we need, the balancing authority needs to ensure that the generation on the grid can participate in the and meet the balancing authority requirements. So because of the motivation that Raphael introduced, there's a declining frequency response nationwide NERC established the Frequency Response Initiative, or FRI, in 2010. So they've been working on establishing a standard for requiring a certain amount of frequency response capability. So as of right now, they have the third posting of the standard up. About a month ago, they had a comment period, and the anticipated actions going forward are that they're going to be responding to these comments and recirculating, and probably in February 2013, their Board of Trustees is going to vote on adoption. And the obligations for each balancing authority to procure frequency response capability start 2 years after the acceptance from the Board of Trustees. So what is proposed in these new regulations? So the goal is to ensure the grid reliability during a frequency event, a loss of generation or loss of load. And so this BAL 003 updated document that they're proposing is determines a method to calculate the frequency response obligation of the entire interconnection, and then a method to divide that down as what fraction of the interconnection frequency response does the balancing authority need to procure. And so that the amount of response that is suggested in as far as the frequency response obligation is designed to ensure grid reliability up to an N-2 contingency event. If we lose 2 generators on the grid, we are not going to have under-frequency load shedding, which is a very undesirable situation as far as grid reliability goes, because we're going to be customers are going to be losing power. And so, like I mentioned, the responsible entities here are the balancing authorities. Although balancing authorities can group together and share resources. They can, if there's a really small balancing authority, they can combine with their larger balancing authority neighbors and share resources. The proposal also specifies violations and in severity levels, and so if they don't have sufficient frequency response capability, they will incur a violation, and those violations can be used to incur financial penalties, for instance. And so there's a recent frequency response study by GE, and they focused on the CAISO, but also looked at the WEC in general. And they looked at large losses in generation and quite high penetrations of variable energy resources, which would be renewable energy, for instance. And the relevant conclusions were that fast-reacting resources are really important to ensure that we avoid under-frequency load shedding. And these fast-reacting resources are such as wind, solar, as well as energy storage technologies. They also said it's really important for the governors that are currently on generation units on the grid to actually be turned on. And they mentioned that turning off the governors on all the generation on the grid has a more significant impact than really high levels of renewable energy integration. So it had a more significant impact as far as the system reliability. And they also mentioned that even with high levels of variable energy resources, there wasn't a dire need to procure additional frequency response capability in CAISO, and we believe that that may also be the case for a lot of the balancing authorities. So the NERC Frequency Response Initiative has come up with a couple of conclusions of recommendations of actions going forward, and that is to update old governors without sufficient response capability to meet a new set of standards of how aggressively they respond to a certain deviation in frequency. Enable the governors that are currently available on the system that are turned off right now just because there's no incentive and no mandate for them to turn them on. And also to utilize frequency responsive services that have faster capabilities, because conventional generation does have a time delay before they respond, and faster services could be demand response, so you're actually controlling the load on the grid. Also, wind and PV, you can electronically control these, and so they can respond with a shorter time delay. And also energy storage technology, and that's automatically absorbing or injecting power onto the grid. So now I'm going to look at the wind penetration that is in Colorado right now. As we mentioned, Colorado in 2011 has, yes?
Is all this implies kind of a reserve margin that's allocated that you need to do this?
Yes, so the attachment A, which is updated annually, which goes along with the current proposed BAL 003 requirement, has particular calculation methods for determining what the frequency response obligation is for each interconnection, and they have actually, for the Western Interconnect, the frequency response obligation is about 800 and something megawatts per 0.01 hertz deviation. So they specify that in these requirements. And then there's also a method of calculating based on the fraction of the generation and load for a balancing authority compared to the generation and load for the entire interconnect. That is the ratio of that entire interconnect frequency response obligation that you need to meet as a balancing authority. So back to the wind penetration in Colorado. In 2011, we had 9.2% energy generation, of our energy generated from wind. There's 2,100 megawatts installed at year's end of 2012. And as I mentioned in the policy section, there's April 15th, 2012, during the night when there was strong winds and low load, there was 57% of the power on PSCO's system was generated from wind power. Now, we're not stating whether or not they did or did not have enough response capability online, but situations such as this raise the question that under high levels of wind penetration, because wind doesn't inherently provide this response capability, they're not required to. The question is, during times of really large percentages of wind power production, do we have enough response capability on the grid? And so this is a breakup of some of the wind turbines that are installed here in Colorado. And actually not included in this plot is the most recent installation, which had the GE 1.6 megawatt turbines. And so why do I break this up into the GE 1.5, 1.6, and Siemens 2.3 megawatt turbines is because we do know that these particular turbines can provide frequency response services. We're not sure about the other 39%. That information wasn't publicly available from the wind turbine manufacturers that comprise that 39%. But we do know, because Siemens and GE both have publicly stated that these turbines do provide frequency response services if you ask for it and if it is required. So then it's up to the wind farm operator or owner to decide whether or not they turn on these frequency response services. So that's over 50% of our wind energy generation here in Colorado actually has the capability of providing a response when the grid frequency fluctuates.
Okay, so I guess we have time to talk about those. So under this recent proposed regulation, the question is raised of possibly having markets for frequency response. One of a little background on this, there's a recent FERC notice of proposed rulemaking called Third-Party Provision of Ancillary Services, which basically try to determine how to analyze power market mechanisms for analyzing if providers have market power or not, and in case they do not, They can have market-based compensation, because nowadays they're compensated by cost, and also there's a potential for future markets in case frequency response continues to decline. There's actually a market established in New Zealand already for that. So a study performed in NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, shows some possible market designs, although those are not applicable directly to Colorado, because here we have bilateral contract markets. It's interesting to take a look at that. Those are applicable to RTO, ISO regions where they have centralized markets. They first proposed 2 different possible designs just to take out the disincentives that exist right now, because they have to follow the schedule, and responding to frequency events might not. It's not scheduled. The two are first possibility would be to eliminate penalties during the frequency events, which would be really simple to implement. Another possibility would be to actually account for how much energy was generated in that frequency event, in order to be more just in canceling the penalties that could be incurred by not following the schedule. 2 other possibilities that would actually have incentives for providing the services would be to have frequency response coupled with spinning reserves. So whoever provides spinning reserves would only get paid if they also provide frequency response. The problem with this would be that these 2 services are not necessarily paired, so you might actually acquire enough spinning reserves but not acquire enough frequency response, or vice versa. Another possibility would be to have a separate market just for frequency response, and that would be really complex to implement, but it has the advantage of not pairing resources, and it's not pairing resources and actually providing incentives, and the 2 first ones don't.
So the compliance period starts the first day of the next quarter, and then plus 24 months, so 2 years. So whenever they accept it, you go to the first day of the next quarter, and then add on 2 years, and that's when the balancing authorities are going to be required to ensure that they have enough frequency response on their system.
Thank you.
Well, it does allow time for maybe new contracts with or power purchase agreements with wind farms to be established, such that the balancing authority has in mind that this will be a requirement, and so asking them to potentially provide these services under certain conditions that will allow time to be able to work that in, for instance. Potentially, yeah. Yes, David.
Just as a point of clarification, because we're inside the U.S. and FERC has approval of those standards, the standard actually wouldn't become effective until 2 years after FERC approves it, as opposed to the Board of Trustees. And that's one of those regulatory things. The FERC process, I would expect, would take at least a year to approve it. Once it's filed, I would say right now you have about 3 years.
Thank you for the clarification. Well, I do know that power quality is the balance of real and imaginary power, the reactive power, and I'm not aware of what the current requirements of that are, so I can't make any comment to that.
That's why I asked.
There's actually some guidelines on the OAT specifically for the PSCO system, but first there are no requirements, so you don't need to necessarily make them or not. And I think, if I remember correctly, they're just, these requirements would be making them more strict, because they're really huge dead bands, as we talked in the policy section, and I think, yeah. Yes?
I would just clarify that this doesn't necessarily have a direct implication on wind facilities, either existing or new. It all depends upon what is your frequency response capability within the balancing authority, and how you meet that may or may not implicate other resources.
There are a number of traditional generators that can provide frequency response that currently aren't, and so it's not as dire as many operations as opposed to infrastructure change to that.
Yeah, and also the existing contracts may not, provide that flexibility or that requirement either. So I think there are a number of different issues that would have to be examined prior to just saying that wind is going to have this requirement.
Right. What we were trying to highlight here is the capability of wind to potentially provide this service, and not that wind is going to be, should be, or can, or is required to provide this service.
Other questions? Well, actually, probably a question to follow up on what you just said is, can this later to comply with the FRO? Or is there a way to how it
Well, if you already have enough frequency response on your system from your conventional generation, then you don't need wind to provide this service. If it is a time, for instance, when you have high wind penetration, lots of power from wind, low conventional generation load, it might be advantageous to have wind provide this service in that sense, because rather than spinning up additional conventional generation to provide frequency response capabilities, the wind could derate and be able to provide those capabilities. But I cannot address the economic viability and which one is more costs.
All right, thank you.
So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And if you want to hang out and have additional conversations, please feel free to do that. We've got a bunch of people here who can answer questions. And yeah, just thanks for being here.